The barn was abandoned, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of the relentless winter storm, snow piled high against its walls, trapping whoever was inside, and there, in the freezing darkness, lay a tiny, shivering puppy, left to perish. But she wasn't alone. A pair of glowing green eyes watched over her, a silent guardian in the night. A stray cat, hardened by the wild, curled up beside the helpless pup, sharing its warmth. Would this unlikely bond be enough to keep her alive until help arrived? What happens next will warm your heart. The barn stood at the edge of a forgotten field, its wooden beams weathered by time and neglect. Snow piled high against the doors, creeping through the cracks, and the wind howled through the broken slats in the roof. Inside, beneath a collapsed haystack, a small, fragile figure lay curled up, barely moving. The puppy was no more than 8 weeks old, a tiny thing with soft, golden fur now matted and dirty. Her small ribs showed through her thin body, and her breathing was shallow, uneven. Her little paws, once full of life, were now stiff with cold. She had been left here, discarded like something worthless. Perhaps someone had once loved her. Perhaps she had once felt the warmth of a home, the gentle touch of human hands. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that remained was the biting cold, creeping into her bones, threatening to take what little strength she had left. She whimpered softly, barely able to lift her head. Her ears twitched at the sound of the wind rattling the barn walls, but she was too weak to move, too tired to fight. She had not eaten in days. Her tiny body shivered violently, her breath fogging the freezing air. Then, movement. A soft rustle in the shadows. At first the puppy thought it was the wind again, another gust slipping through the cracks. But then a pair of glowing green eyes appeared in the darkness, watching her. The figure moved gracefully, silently, its paws making no sound on the frozen wooden floor. And then, from the shadows, a cat emerged. He was a large, lean tomcat, with thick, dark grey fur streaked with silver. His tail was long, flicking slightly as he observed the tiny creature before him. His body carried the scars of survival. Scratches across his ears, a small notch missing from his left ear, signs of battles fought and won. He was a creature of the wild, hardened by hunger and cold, by nights spent searching for food and shelter. But his eyes, sharp and intelligent, held something more than mere instinct. The puppy shivered again, a faint whimper escaping her lips. The cat did not flinch. He did not hiss or arch his back in fear. Instead, he took a step closer, his breath visible in the icy air. He sniffed cautiously, his whiskers twitching before lowering himself onto the ground, and then, to the puppy's surprise, the cat curled up beside her. His fur, though cold from the wind, was thick and warm. He pressed his body close to hers, his tail curling around her trembling form. The puppy barely had the strength to react, but instinctively she nestled into the warmth, feeling for the first time in days something other than the cruel bite of the winter air. The cat did not purr. He did not make a sound. He simply stayed, his body a shield against the cold, his steady breathing a quiet reassurance that she was not alone. Hours passed. The night deepened. The wind screamed outside, rattling the barn doors, but inside, beneath the old, rotting beams, a fragile sense of safety remained. The puppy's breathing slowed, steadied. The warmth of the cat's body, though not much, was enough. Enough to keep her heart beating through the night, enough to stop the darkness from taking her. And as the storm raged outside, the two small creatures, one abandoned, one wild, held onto each other against the cold, against the world. At first, the warmth of the cat was the only thing the puppy could feel, a fragile heat against the numbing cold that had seeped into her bones. It was unfamiliar, yet comforting, like a distant memory of something she had once known, but had since forgotten. She no longer shivered as violently, though the exhaustion of hunger and cold still weighed heavy on her small body. She could not remember how long she had been here, only that the world had shrunk to the wooden walls of this forgotten barn and the quiet presence of the feline beside her. The cat did not speak, did not make a sound beyond the soft rustle of his fur as he adjusted his position, ensuring she remained close to his warmth. His breathing was steady, his body firm against hers, as though silently declaring that, at least for now, she would not be alone. As the hours stretched into days, the puppy began to stir more often, lifting her head weakly and blinking up at her unlikely guardian. The cat's green eyes regarded her with that same measured caution, unreadable and sharp, yet there was no hostility in his gaze. His presence had become something of a constant, an unspoken promise in the silence of the abandoned barn. He came and went as he pleased, slipping through the cracks in the wooden slats to vanish into the howling white beyond, but he always returned. And each time he did, the puppy whimpered in soft relief, nuzzling against the warmth of his fur, as though afraid he might one day disappear and not return. The cat, strong, wiry, and built for survival, had lived this way for as long as he could remember. He had never needed companionship, never sought comfort from another, but something about the helpless creature curled up beside him stirred something deep in his instincts. He knew hunger, knew the sharp edge of cold and the desperate need to survive, and he recognized in the puppy that same struggle. Unlike him, she was not meant for this life. She was soft, fragile, not built for the brutal solitude of the wild. He had no reason to help her, no obligation to care whether she lived or died, and yet, when she whimpered in the night, when she pressed closer to him for warmth, something in him refused to turn away. In time, the puppy found the strength to move, to lift her head, to follow the cat's movements with curious, sleepy eyes. And when he left the barn, slipping into the snow-covered world beyond, she would wait, ears perked at the slightest sound of his return. He always came back, sometimes shaking the snow from his thick fur, sometimes carrying a small prize between his teeth, a lifeless mouse, a scrap of something edible. He would drop it near her without ceremony, watching as she sniffed at it with hesitation. She was not used to this kind of food, was not born to hunt or scavenge, but hunger made her desperate, and in time she learned to eat. It was a slow, careful existence, bound together by necessity rather than choice. The cat continued to hunt, bringing back what little he could find, and the puppy, still weak but growing stronger, relied on him completely. The barn became their shared world, a tiny sanctuary against the endless snowstorm raging beyond its broken walls. The wind howled through the gaps, shaking the wooden beams and piling drifts of white powder against the doors, but together they endured. As the days passed, the puppy's strength began to return. She no longer lay motionless in the straw, waiting for warmth to find her. She began to follow the cat with her eyes, then with cautious, stumbling steps, her small paws pressing into the frozen floor as she tried to keep up. She was still weak, still fragile, but there was life in her movements now, a spark that had not been there before. She yipped softly when the cat returned from his hunts, wagging her tail in slow, uncertain motions. He ignored her at first, barely acknowledging the small, excited movements, but in time he accepted that she was his shadow, always trailing behind him. She was smaller than she should have been, her body still underfed, and her fur too thin for the harsh cold. But her eyes, once dull and lifeless, now carried a quiet determination. She had survived, and she would continue to survive so long as she had him. But the winter was relentless. The snow deepened, covering the world in an endless sheet of white, and food became harder to find. Even the cat, accustomed to the hunt, struggled. The mice had retreated, burrowing deep beneath the frozen earth, and the harsh wind made stalking prey all the more difficult. He began to return empty-mouthed, his tail flicking in frustration as he curled up beside the puppy, both of them growing weaker with each passing day. The barn, once their refuge, now felt more like a trap. The doors, frozen shut by ice and snow, sealed them in, making it impossible for the cat to hunt as freely as before. The howling wind no longer just threatened to seep in. It pressed against the walls with a force that shook the wooden beams, rattling the very foundation of their sanctuary. The puppy whimpered, sensing the growing danger, and even the cat could not offer her the same silent reassurance he once had. One night, the cold became unbearable. The cat, ever the survivor, knew that staying meant death. If they did not leave soon, if they did not find warmth, food, shelter, something, they would not last much longer. But the puppy, still weaker than him, could not survive alone. He would have to take her with him. And so, for the first time, the cat did something he had never done before. He meowed, loudly, desperately. It was not the quiet, calculated sound of a hunter, nor the warning growl of an animal marking its territory. It was a cry, a call for something, someone to hear. The puppy whimpered beside him, pressing close, not understanding but trusting. And so, as the storm raged on outside, the two small creatures, one wild, one abandoned, waited for an answer, for a miracle, for a chance to survive. The days stretched long, each one colder than the last, each night darker, heavier, pressing down on the small, fragile lives curled together in the abandoned barn. The cold was no longer just an external force. It had seeped deep into their bones, wrapped around their weakened bodies like an invisible chain, dragging them toward an inevitable end. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, a dull, aching reminder that their time was running out. The little puppy, once filled with newfound determination, now barely lifted her head. Her tiny breaths came in shallow gasps, her once curious eyes now dull and half-lidded, surrendering to exhaustion. Even the cat, strong and resilient as he was, could feel his body weakening, his movements slower, his hunts growing more futile with each passing day. The storm had not relented. Snow had piled high outside the barn doors, sealing them in, trapping them within their sanctuary-turned prison. The cat had tried to find a way out, scratching at the wooden planks, testing every possible escape route, but the relentless ice held them firm. His usual patience was thinning, replaced with the gnawing knowledge that they would not last much longer. The puppy had stopped trying to stand, stopped whining for warmth, simply lying there, her breaths slow, her body still. The cat nudged her gently, his cold nose brushing against her thin fur, but she barely stirred. He watched her for a moment, his green eyes flickering with something unreadable, before he made a decision. He stretched his thin, trembling body and let out a sound that had not left his throat in years. A long, desperate meow. It was not the sound of a hunter, not the sharp warning he used to claim his space, but something raw and pleading, something meant to be heard. He lifted his head, his voice growing louder, cutting through the howling wind. Again and again he called, his cries sharp and unwavering, refusing to be swallowed by the storm. The puppy, in her semi-conscious state, felt the vibrations of his voice, the sound reaching through the haze of her fading awareness. Something inside her stirred. She had never known a mother's call, had never been taught the way to seek help, but instinct ran deep. Slowly, weakly, she parted her lips and let out a soft, pitiful whimper. It was barely a sound at first, just a breath against the cold, but then it grew, a tiny, broken cry, joining the cat's desperate call into the night. Beyond the barn, in the vast whiteness of the storm, the world remained silent. Snow continued to fall, thick and endless, muffling sound and swallowing any trace of warmth. But then, faintly, barely noticeable, a light flickered in the distance. It was not the cold, indifferent glow of the moon hidden behind thick clouds, nor the distant glimmer of some forgotten farmhouse. It was artificial, golden, moving, searching. Miles away, Sarah Jenkins guided her truck carefully down the narrow, ice-laden road. A woman of 54, she had lived in this rural stretch of land for most of her life, accustomed to the brutal winters, the isolation, the unforgiving landscape that swallowed the unprepared. Her frame was strong despite the years, her hands rough from decades of work, her face lined but kind, framed by loose strands of grey-streaked brown hair that had long since given up trying to be tamed. She wore a heavy coat, patched at the elbows, and thick boots caked with snow. Sarah had always had a soft heart for lost things. It was why, despite living alone, she kept the porch light on at night, why she always carried a spare blanket in her truck, and why she never ignored a sound out of place in the vast silence of the countryside. That night, she had ventured out for firewood when she heard it, a sound barely distinguishable from the wind at first, but unmistakable once she paused to listen. A cat's cry, desperate and unrelenting. It was coming from the old abandoned barn at the edge of her property, a place she had not stepped foot in for years. She hesitated only a moment before turning her truck onto the unmarked path leading toward the barn, the wheels crunching against the thick layer of snow. The headlights illuminated the skeletal remains of the structure, the broken wood barely holding against the weight of winter. As she stepped out, her breath formed a mist in the frigid air, her boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. She reached for the barn door, her gloved hands struggling against the ice-sealed wood, and pulled with all the strength she had. The door groaned, the ice crackling as it gave way just enough for her to squeeze inside. Her flashlight cut through the shadows, and the sight before her made her breath hitch. A cat, lean and battle-worn, sat near the center of the barn, his green eyes flashing with cautious defiance. His body was tense, ready to bolt, but he did not run. Instead, he stood his ground, his tail flicking once in warning, and beside him, barely visible against the straw, was a puppy, small, fragile, unmoving save for the faint rise and fall of her ribs. Sarah's heart clenched. She had seen enough stray animals in her time to know when one was too far gone, when the cold had taken too much. But there was something in the way the cat positioned himself, in the way he had cried out again and again, in the way his thin frame stood protectively over the shivering pup, that made her believe just for a moment that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Moving slowly, she knelt down, reaching into her coat to pull out an old wool blanket. She spoke softly, her voice warm despite the cold. "Easy, buddy," she murmured, her gaze flicking between the cat and the tiny, half-conscious pup. "I'm here to help." The cat didn't move, his ears flattening slightly, but he did not hiss, did not strike. He only watched as she wrapped the puppy carefully in the thick fabric, his sharp eyes following every motion. The little dog whimpered at the sudden change, her body barely reacting, her fur damp with melted snow. Sarah tucked the bundle close to her chest, feeling the faint tremor of life within it, and turned back to the cat. "You coming too?" she asked, as if expecting an answer. For a long moment, he did not move. His tail flicked once more, his body poised, his expression unreadable. And then, as if making a decision of his own, he leapt forward, landing lightly on her shoulder before settling against the crook of her neck. Sarah let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "All right then," she murmured, standing with her new passengers. "Let's get you both warmed up." Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the small lives it had nearly stolen. But inside Sarah's truck, as she cranked the heat and turned toward home, warmth was returning, slow and steady, melting the edge of the cold. The puppy, still weak, nestled deeper into the blanket, her body pressing close against Sarah's chest. The cat remained perched on her shoulder, silent but watchful, his green eyes reflecting the headlights cutting through the night. For the first time in weeks, neither of them were alone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a chance to survive. The wind howled against the windows, rattling the old farmhouse like a restless ghost. Sarah sat near the fireplace, a worn woolen blanket draped over her shoulders, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The storm had been raging for hours, the snow piling higher against the porch steps, turning her secluded world into an icy prison. She had lived in this farmhouse for nearly 20 years, alone since her husband had passed, her days filled with tending to the land and the few animals that remained under her care. She had grown used to the silence, to the stillness of winter, but that night, something unsettled her. A sound cut through the howling wind, faint at first, nearly swallowed by the storm, but persistent. A cry, not the mournful whistle of the wind, nor the groaning of old wooden beams, but something alive. Sarah set her cup down, her brow furrowing. A cat, out in this weather? She stood, grabbing her thick winter coat from the peg by the door. Pulling it tightly around her, she grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, bracing against the bitter cold. The wind bit at her cheeks, turning her breath into plumes of mist as she trudged forward, the snow reaching past her ankles. The sound came again, sharper this time, more desperate. Her boots crunched over the ice as she followed the cry, the flashlight's beam slicing through the swirling snow. The barn loomed ahead, half buried in the storm, its weathered frame barely visible against the darkness. She hadn't thought about that place in years, not since the roof had started caving in. It was useless now, just another forgotten relic on the land she tended alone. But something was inside, something calling for help. She hesitated only briefly before shoving against the frozen door, the old wood groaning in protest. It took 2 tries before the ice cracked and the door gave way, revealing the dark interior. She lifted the flashlight, the beam flickering across the barn's skeletal remains, the dust-laden rafters, the broken boards. And then, in the center of it all, she saw them. A cat, sleek and grey, crouched low, his fur puffed against the cold. His green eyes gleamed in the light, locked onto hers, fierce and untrusting. He was thin, but not fragile, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. But it wasn't the cat that stole Sarah's breath. It was the tiny, trembling form beside him. A puppy, no more than a few weeks old, lay limp against the straw, her golden fur damp and matted, her breath barely visible in the freezing air. The cat stood over her, his body curved protectively, as if shielding her from an unseen danger. Sarah's heart clenched. She moved cautiously, keeping her voice soft. "Hey there, buddy," she murmured, stepping closer. The cat didn't move, but his ears flattened slightly, his tail flicking once, a silent warning. Sarah knew that look, wild, untamed, survival hardened into instinct. He didn't trust her, but he had called for help, hadn't he? He had stayed, guarding the tiny creature at his side, despite the cold, despite the hunger gnawing at his own belly. Sarah lowered herself onto one knee, reaching into her coat for a thick wool blanket. "It's okay," she whispered, inching forward. "I'm here to help." The puppy whimpered weakly at the sound of her voice, her little body barely stirring. That was all it took. The cat hesitated for a moment longer, then, with a low growl, stepped back just enough for Sarah to move in. Gently she wrapped the trembling puppy in the warm fabric, cradling her close. Her fingers brushed against icy fur, feeling the slow, weak rise and fall of a fragile chest. She was so small, so cold. Sarah pulled the bundle close to her chest, her arms tightening protectively around the tiny life within. Then she turned to the cat. He sat still, his eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, unreadable. She knew he wouldn't survive out here either, not in this storm, not with his body already weakened from hunger. "You coming?" she asked softly. For a long moment the cat remained frozen, his sharp gaze flickering between her and the storm outside. Then, with a sudden, graceful leap, he landed on her shoulder, his claws gripping just enough to hold on without hurting her. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "All right then," she murmured. "Let's get you both home." She turned and stepped out of the barn, pushing the door shut against the wind. The walk back felt longer, the weight of responsibility heavy in her arms. The cat clung to her, his body pressed close against the warmth of her coat. The puppy barely moved, only an occasional weak breath reassuring her that she was still alive. By the time she reached the farmhouse, Sarah's fingers were numb, her cheeks stinging from the cold. She kicked the door shut behind her, hurrying to the fireplace where the embers still glowed faintly. Setting the puppy down carefully on a thick blanket near the fire, she unwrapped her, rubbing gently to bring warmth back into the tiny body. The cat leapt from her shoulder, landing lightly beside his companion, his sharp eyes never leaving Sarah as she worked. She moved quickly, grabbing a clean towel and a small bowl of warm water. Dipping the towel in, she wiped away the frost clinging to the puppy's fur, checking for injuries, feeling the fragile heartbeat beneath her touch. "Come on, little one," she whispered. "Stay with me." The minutes stretched into eternity, but slowly warmth returned. The puppy let out a soft, breathy whimper, her tiny paws twitching. Encouraged, Sarah reached for a bottle, filling it with warmed milk. "You're lucky I keep supplies," she muttered, mostly to herself, as she carefully brought the bottle to the puppy's mouth. At first, nothing. Then, weakly, the little dog's mouth latched on, sucking in the first bit of nourishment she had had in who knew how long. Relief flooded Sarah's chest. She let out a shaky laugh, glancing at the cat. "She's a fighter," she murmured. The cat, still silent, settled himself beside the puppy, his tail curling around her, as if to reassure her that he was still there. Watching them, Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. How long had they been together? How had this wild, street-smart cat become the protector of a creature so defenseless? Whatever their story was, it was clear that they had survived because of each other. She leaned back, letting out a long sigh. "Guess I have 2 new houseguests," she mused. The cat blinked at her, unimpressed. Sarah chuckled. Yeah, I get it. You're in charge." The storm continued to rage outside, the wind screaming against the windows, but inside, by the crackling fire, warmth was beginning to return. The puppy had stopped shivering, her tiny body relaxed against the blanket. The cat, though still watchful, had lowered his head onto his paws, finally allowing himself a moment of rest. Sarah sat back, watching them, her heart unexpectedly full. She had lived alone for so long, her house filled with silence and memories. But tonight, the quiet was different. It was no longer empty. It was no longer just her against the long, unforgiving winter. For the first time in years, her home had life in it again. 4-0. The night was still heavy with the weight of the storm, but inside Sarah's home, warmth flickered against the walls, chasing away the cold that clung to the 2 fragile creatures she had just rescued. She knelt by the fire, carefully adjusting the thick wool blanket wrapped around the tiny, trembling puppy. The cat sat rigidly beside her, his green eyes never leaving his small companion, his body tense, ready to pounce should this unfamiliar woman make a wrong move. There was no trust yet, only a silent agreement between them. Sarah had saved them, but the cat was still the guardian. The puppy barely moved, her golden fur damp, her tiny ribs pressing against her delicate skin with each shallow breath. Sarah reached out, her weathered hands gentle as she stroked the small creature, feeling the chill still clinging to her. "Come on, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice low, soothing. "Stay with me." She carefully rubbed the puppy's limbs, trying to encourage circulation, trying to remind her tiny body that it was safe now, that it could fight. She disappeared for a moment, returning with a heating pad wrapped in an old towel, setting it beneath the puppy's frail form. Then she placed a shallow dish of water nearby, though she knew the pup wouldn't be able to drink on her own just yet. The cat, watching her every move, gave a soft flick of his tail, his sharp gaze flicking from Sarah's hands to the small dog. as if assessing whether or not she was doing enough. "You're worried too, huh?" she said softly, glancing at him. "I'll do my best." Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside the fire crackled steadily, the warmth slowly seeping into frozen bones. Sarah didn't sleep. She stayed near them, listening for any signs of distress, watching for any movement. The puppy stirred only slightly, her breaths remaining weak, but she was still alive. That was all Sarah needed for now. But by morning, worry crept into her bones like the cold that had nearly stolen the pup's life. She wasn't improving fast enough. Even with warmth, even with the tiny sips of water Sarah had coaxed into her mouth, she was still too weak, too still. Sarah had seen this before, had taken in enough strays over the years to recognize the signs of a body barely clinging to life. She knew she couldn't wait. Moving quickly, she wrapped the puppy in the blanket once more, cradling her against her chest as she grabbed her keys from the counter. The cat, realizing what was happening, leapt from the couch and padded swiftly to the door, blocking her way with his sleek, lean body. His tail twitched, his green eyes flashing with something close to panic. He didn't understand where she was taking the puppy, but he knew enough to recognize that his friend was being moved. Sarah crouched down, balancing the fragile weight of the puppy in one arm as she extended her other hand to the cat. "I promise," she said softly. "I'm trying to save her." The cat hesitated only a moment before stepping back, though his ears remained flattened in protest. Sarah didn't waste another second. She pushed through the door, bracing against the lingering cold as she moved swiftly toward her truck, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The drive to town was slow, treacherous. The roads were slick with ice, the storm having coated everything in a thick layer of white. But Sarah kept her grip steady, her hands firm on the wheel, her heart racing with the knowledge that time was slipping through her fingers. The old veterinary clinic stood at the edge of town, a small but sturdy building with a faded blue sign that read, Dr. William Carter, DVM. Dr. Carter had been the town's vet for as long as Sarah could remember. A man in his late 60s, his broad frame had begun to soften with age, his once dark hair now almost entirely white. He was a no-nonsense type, his gruff voice often carrying an air of impatience, but beneath the hardened exterior was a man who had spent his life caring for animals, who had never once turned away a creature in need. Sarah barely had time to knock before the door swung open, revealing Dr. Carter in his usual flannel shirt and worn-out jeans, his eyes narrowing at the sight of her standing there, snow-covered and out of breath, clutching the fragile bundle in her arms. "Damn, Sarah," he muttered, stepping aside. "What have you got for me?" Without hesitation, she moved inside, the warmth of the clinic washing over her as she unwrapped the puppy, just enough for him to see. His expression shifted immediately from mild irritation to concern as he took the tiny creature from her arms, his experienced hands moving quickly, efficiently. He carried the puppy to an examination table, pressing a stethoscope to her tiny chest, listening, feeling for any sign of a stronger heartbeat. Sarah stood back, arms crossed, her fingers tapping anxiously against her sleeve. "She was left in my barn," she explained, voice tight with emotion. "I don't know how long she was out there, but it was long enough that she nearly froze to death." Dr. Carter didn't respond immediately. He continued his work, checking the puppy's temperature, examining her frail limbs, his face unreadable. Finally, he let out a slow breath, rubbing his fingers over his forehead. "She's weak," he said, "badly malnourished, dehydrated, but she's got a chance." Sarah exhaled, feeling some of the weight lift from her chest. "What do I do?" Dr. Carter began moving, pulling supplies from cabinets, preparing fluids. "We start slow. Fluids, warmth, careful feeding. No sudden changes. She needs stability, Sarah." He glanced up at her, his expression softer now. "And she's going to need you." Sarah nodded without hesitation. "I'm not leaving her." The next few hours were a careful battle. The puppy was given fluids through a small IV, her body carefully monitored. Sarah sat beside the table the entire time, watching, waiting, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the blanket wrapped around the fragile creature. The cat, back at home, would be waiting. He wouldn't understand where his tiny companion had gone, wouldn't know if she was coming back. But Sarah would bring her home. She had to. It wasn't until late afternoon that Dr. Carter finally looked up, a small, tired smile on his face. "She's responding," he said. "Slowly, but she is." Relief crashed over Sarah like a wave. She reached out, gently brushing a finger over the puppy's tiny head. "Thank you," she whispered. Dr. Carter nodded, packing away his equipment. "Take her home," he instructed. "Keep her warm, keep her fed. And Sarah?" He met her gaze. "You just saved a life today." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding. As she carefully lifted the small bundle into her arms once more, feeling the steady warmth returning, she knew one thing with certainty. This puppy wasn't just another stray. She wasn't just something to save and send away. She was home now. And as Sarah stepped out into the cold once more, turning towards her truck, she smiled for the first time in a long while, knowing that waiting at home by the fire was a grey cat who had never left his friend's side. The winter sun filtered weakly through the farmhouse windows, casting pale golden light onto the wooden floors. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the small living room with warmth that had long been absent from Sarah's home. On a thick, folded blanket near the fireplace lay the little puppy, her golden fur now clean, her fragile body no longer trembling from the cold. She was still weak, still recovering, but the life that had once been drained from her was slowly returning. Every so often her tiny tail would twitch in her sleep, her paws stretching slightly as if she were chasing something in a dream. Just beside her, curled up in a protective arc, was the grey cat. His lean body pressed against the puppy's, his tail draped lazily over her small back. His sharp green eyes flickered open every few minutes, scanning the room before settling back into a comfortable, watchful half-sleep. He had not left her side since she returned from the vet, as if afraid she might disappear again. Sarah sat in her old rocking chair, a mug of tea warming her hands, watching the two of them. It had been nearly a week since she had brought them home, and in that time she had learned something remarkable. These two creatures were inseparable. It wasn't just companionship, it was something deeper, a bond forged in the cold, in survival, in the quiet understanding of what it meant to be abandoned. At first, Sarah had thought the puppy's attachment to the cat was simply a reaction to fear. After all, she had known nothing but the warmth of that feline body when she had been on the brink of death. But as the days passed, it became clear that this was something more than dependency. The puppy followed the cat wherever he went, her tiny legs struggling to keep up with his graceful, fluid movements. When the cat leapt onto the couch, the puppy would whimper until Sarah lifted her up to sit beside him. When the cat padded into the kitchen, the puppy would stumble after him, her tail wagging weakly. And when Sarah tried to separate them, even for just a moment, the puppy would cry in distress, a soft, heartbreaking sound that made Sarah's chest tighten. The cat, for all his independent and aloof nature, tolerated it in a way Sarah had never seen before. He didn't swat the puppy away, didn't hiss when she clumsily pawed at his tail. Instead, he simply let her be, as if he had long accepted that she was a part of him now. There was something almost resigned in the way he watched over her, as if he had made a decision long ago that she was his responsibility, and there was no turning back. Sarah sighed, taking a slow sip of her tea. "Well," she muttered, "I guess that settles it." She hadn't planned on keeping them. She had told herself, from the moment she had carried that frozen puppy into her home, that she was only providing temporary care, that once they were strong enough, she would find them good homes, places where they could be loved and cared for properly. But now, looking at them, at the way they fit so seamlessly into her once empty home, she knew she couldn't let them go. The truth was, she needed them just as much as they needed her. She had lived alone for years, the silence of the farmhouse stretching endlessly, only broken by the occasional visitor or the hum of the radio she left on for company. Her husband, Frank, had passed nearly a decade ago, leaving behind a house too big and memories that refused to fade. She had learned to live with the quiet, had made peace with the solitude, but now, with the soft sounds of paws against the wooden floors, with the warmth of two small bodies curled up beside her chair, the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. The decision made, she stood, stretching her stiff legs, and walked over to the pair. The cat's green eyes flickered open immediately, alert as ever, but he didn't move as Sarah knelt beside them. The puppy, sensing movement, stirred, her soft brown eyes blinking sleepily up at Sarah before her tiny tail began wagging in slow, happy beats. Sarah chuckled, reaching out to scratch behind the puppy's ears. "I suppose I ought to name you two, huh?" She had put it off for days, unsure if naming them would make it harder when it was time to say goodbye. But now there was no need to hesitate. These weren't just animals she had rescued. They were family now. She looked at the cat first, his sharp, intelligent gaze meeting hers without fear. He was a survivor, strong and proud, with a quiet sense of loyalty that he never asked for, but carried anyway. "How about Ash?" she mused. "Dark as the cinders in the fireplace, tough as nails." The cat blinked at her, slow and deliberate. He neither accepted nor rejected the name, merely acknowledging it as though he knew he had little say in the matter. Sarah smirked, then turned her attention to the puppy. She was small, delicate, but there was a fire inside her, a will to live that had kept her breathing even when the cold had tried to steal her away. She had survived against the odds, had found warmth in the most unexpected place. "And you," Sarah murmured, stroking the soft fur on the puppy's head. "Your ember, a tiny spark that refused to go out." The puppy yipped softly, nuzzling into Sarah's palm as if accepting the name, her little tail wagging faster. Sarah sat back on her heels watching them, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Ash and Ember, two lost souls who had found their way to each other and to her. That night, as Sarah climbed into bed, she expected the usual loneliness to settle in, the quiet weight of an empty house pressing against her chest. But as she pulled the blankets around her, she heard the soft sound of paws padding across the floor. A moment later, a small weight pressed against the edge of her bed, followed by another. She turned her head, smiling softly as she saw them. Ash, ever the silent protector, had jumped up first, his lean body curling at the foot of the bed, his green eyes watching, making sure everything was as it should be. Ember, too small to climb up on her own, let out a tiny whimper, pawing at the mattress. Sarah laughed softly, reaching down to lift the puppy onto the bed, settling her beside Ash. She turned off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness. But this time, it wasn't lonely. For the first time in years, she fell asleep to the sound of steady breathing beside her, the warmth of two small lives pressed against her own. And as the winter wind howled outside, rattling the farmhouse walls, Sarah slept peacefully, knowing that inside, in the glow of the fireplace, a new kind of warmth had taken root, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with family. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the land, though remnants of its icy touch still clung to the trees and rooftops in delicate layers of frost. The heavy snowdrifts had begun to shrink under the lengthening days, and the once barren fields were now speckled with patches of brown earth, promising the return of spring. Inside the farmhouse, nestled among the rolling hills on the outskirts of town, warmth had long since settled in, not just from the crackling fireplace, but from the quiet, unspoken bond that had grown between three unlikely souls. Ember was no longer the frail, trembling creature Sarah had carried out of the barn that fateful night. She had grown into a strong, spirited dog, her once thin frame now filled out with soft golden fur that shimmered in the morning light. Her legs had gained strength, her tail wagged with boundless energy, and her brown eyes sparkled with life. She had discovered a world beyond survival, a world of warm hands that scratched behind her ears, of bowls that were never empty, of laughter that echoed through the once silent house. But despite her playful nature, there was one thing that never changed. Wherever she went, Ash was never far behind. The grey cat remained as sleek and sharp-eyed as ever, his body still carrying the wiry strength of a hunter, his movements as graceful as shadows slipping between the trees. He did not lose his wild instincts, did not become the kind of cat that curled up on laps or purred at every touch. But he was loyal in his own way, watching from the windowsill as Ember played outside, leaping onto the bed each night to settle at the foot of it, always keeping one eye on the dog, who had once been nothing more than a shivering pup lost in the cold. He still disappeared sometimes, slipping through the open door to prowl in the early hours of the morning, but he always came back. He had chosen this place, this home, and there was nothing that could pull him away from it now. Sarah, too, had changed. She had lived in quiet solitude for so many years, her world confined to the walls of her farmhouse and the familiar paths she walked alone. But since that night, since the moment she had knelt in the snow and lifted a dying puppy into her arms, something within her had shifted. Her house was no longer just a house, it was a home again, filled with the soft sounds of paws against the wooden floor, of Ember's eager yips and Ash's low, warning growls whenever she got too close to knocking over one of Sarah's old vases. She had never thought she would be the kind of person to own pets. Her husband had always wanted a dog, had often talked about getting one to keep him company on the farm, but life had gotten in the way. And then it had just been her. It had been easier to let the house remain silent. But now, as she watched Ember chase after a flurry of wind-blown leaves, her ears perked and her tail wagging, while Ash observed from a low-hanging branch, his green eyes flicking between Sarah and the dog as if ensuring everything remained in order, she could no longer imagine life without them. As the days grew longer and the snow continued to retreat, Sarah found herself preparing for the arrival of spring in a way she hadn't in years. She pulled out her old gardening tools, dusting off the dirt that had gathered over time, and made plans to bring life back to the empty flower beds surrounding the house. She cleared out the old barn, fixing the doors so that Ash could slip in and out freely, knowing the cat still liked having his own space, a place that belonged only to him. She let Ember roam farther across the fields, trusting that no matter how far she wandered, she would always come running back the moment Sarah called her name. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch, her mug of tea warm in her hands, she watched as Ember trotted toward her from across the yard, her fur ruffled from the wind. Ash was perched on the porch railing, his tail curling around his paws as he flicked an ear in acknowledgement of Sarah's presence. The sunset bathed the landscape in hues of gold and amber, reflecting in Ember's coat, in the glint of Ash's eyes, in the soft smile that touched Sarah's lips. She reached down, running her fingers through Ember's fur as the dog pressed against her side, content. "You were just a tiny thing when I found you," she murmured, her voice thick with something she couldn't quite name. "Barely holding on." Ember licked her hand, her brown eyes filled with nothing but love. Sarah glanced at Ash, who simply blinked, unbothered as ever. She chuckled, shaking her head. "And you," she mused. "For all your attitude, you never left her side." The cat stretched lazily, his claws gripping the wood beneath him before settling back down. Sarah exhaled softly, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. She had spent so many winters in silence, watching the snow fall without anyone to share it with. But this winter had been different. It had started with loneliness, with a barn buried in snow and a desperate cry in the dark. It had started with a dying puppy and a wild cat who refused to leave her behind. But it had ended with something else entirely. Love. Not the kind she had once known, not the love she had shared with her husband, nor the love of family she had long since outlived. But love all the same, the quiet, unwavering kind, the kind that settled into the small moments, in the warmth of a fire on a cold night, in the familiar weight of a cat at the end of the bed, in the way a dog would nuzzle her hand just to remind her she was never truly alone. The wind shifted, carrying with it the promise of spring, of new beginnings. Sarah closed her eyes, breathing it in. For the first time in years, she wasn't just waiting for the seasons to change. She was looking forward to them.